Do you want to hear Ryan Wallman's predictions for marketing in 2025?
Hit me.
An ad campaign will win every award that exists. Apart from the creative director's bemused family members, nobody outside the industry will ever see the campaign. Another one. Someone will make a mildly critical point about the role of brand purpose. This will attract a tsunami of vitriol from marketers who, coincidentally, have a vested interest in brand purpose. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to On the Dotcast. If you've seen any of our previous episodes, thank you very much for staying tuned. But also, you know the drill by now. We usually put a group of consumers under the microscope, see what's happening with them, what's going on, what's changing. Today, we're doing something slightly different, slightly narcissistic, you could argue. But we're putting ourselves onto the microscope and looking at marketers as a whole and how they differ to the general population. Chris, give us the spiel.
Yes. So, I mean, as many listeners, viewers will know that we offer a platform that allows brands to profile target audiences, look into what motivates them, which, you know, classic use case would be you work on a campaign, you understand your audience a bit better, like where you might put your ad budget and just get a sense of like the messaging you might use.
Yeah.
But of course, in part of the surveys that we do to inform all that data, we ask people what they work in. And one of those sectors is marketing. So we thought, well, why not create an audience of marketers so that we can better understand ourselves?
Yeah.
So instead of thinking about a group of consumers, we can try to understand ourselves a bit better, which maybe might teach us something about potential biases, blind spots, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So our contribution to ongoing discussion, I think.
Really, really cool. Essentially, it feels quite meta, right? We're two marketers teaching other marketers how to market to marketers. But also, we were talking about this earlier in the sense that you kind of like explaining how our brains work so that we can better understand ourselves and therefore, as you say, know our blind spots and know how different our point of view might sometimes be.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, there's a great thing about data, isn't it? Like it gives you that read on the world outside your own.
Yeah.
I should say, you know, for purpose of clarity, like we're going to be focused on UK marketers today because that's where we're based. That's obviously the cultural context that we understand the best. But if you wanted to do an exercise for a current country, that's something you can pretty easily do on the platform.
Yeah, really easily. So where should we start then? Like what's the kind of headline thing? I mean, obviously with marketing, the whole role is to be the voice of the customer, right? So
yeah. If
we aren't able to tap into that mindset, then it's tricky, right? Because we don't want to live in an echo chamber, and it's really important to, especially if you're doing a lot of B2C marketing as well, not just B2B, because you want to be making sure that you're appealing to an audience that might be very different to you, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I'm quite interested to get a read from you because you do marketing for us, right? That is part of your role.
Yeah.
I think, you know, to me, I mean, I work in sort of marketing function, bit of an outsider, is like, there's almost this sort of paradox or tension within marketing is that, you know, a lot of us have been on quite similar pathways, you know, been to university, got degrees in kind of similar fields like humanities, arts, social sciences, that kind of thing. Usually you go to, I mean, a bit different now with remote work, of course, but you go to a London, a Manchester to get your job. Of course, when you go through all those steps, you end up with a smaller group of people, maybe similar in certain ways, but then once you're there, the exercise you have to do is imagine the world outside that. Yeah. And you might be dealing with a target group that's actually quite different from you. But of course, the voices that are around you might not be fully representative. I mean, is that thing a fair description?
I'd say so. So one of the two things I want to say. So firstly, I have this running joke with myself that whenever I'm on the tube and I look at ads, I'm always looking to see if other people are looking at the ads, first of all. And second point is I'm always wondering if they're looking at the ads from the same perspective that I'm looking at the ads from, which is, what's that branding like? Is the copy the best that it could be? Would I have put that full stop there? Would I have done title case or sentence case, you know? And I often wonder, like, because we have like an adspiration channel in Slack where we share ads that we really like and ads that we don't like. And it really helps to kind of give us inspo and that sort of thing. And it really generates a lot of conversation in the channel. But one of the things that's really interesting is, like, do consumers or people that don't work in marketing, are they talking about advertising or ads as much as we are? No, probably not. So there's an argument, like, is it more subconscious the way that a regular consumer who doesn't work in marketing or advertising they're approaching the material in a completely different way,
Yeah.
and probably in a more subconscious way, and probably in a more like disengaged way, like more peripheral vision way, right? Whereas I'm taking a picture of it and sharing it on a Slack channel and saying, what do you guys think about this angle? What do you think about this rebrand? Da, da, da. So you're right, we are in a bubble, and we all kind of are talking about marketing and ads a lot of the time, and it's actually quite common that we all tend to agree on what is a good ad and what is a bad ad, which I think is interesting. I don't know if that's telling of the general population, or if that's more like, well, we're all in the same team and we all have similar mindsets, which is kind of what you were saying earlier, like similar life paths have followed to this point, right?
Yeah, we might have a certain idea of like, oh, this ad isn't going to resonate with target audience, but do we know? We're not in that group.
Exactly.
And I think this certain overlaps with marketing and politics. I think if you work in politics, I mean, you probably know people that do. It's like you think about politics all the time, you're consumed by it, but actually most people, like, I think peripheral vision is a really good analogy for it. It's like it's around you, but it's not something you're thinking about sweating over the small stuff in the way that we do. Yeah. And I mean, you've probably seen as well on TikTok, you'll have accounts that are like rating the ads that I saw on the tube today, which I think is great, because it presupposes that one, people that are interested in it, and two, well, yeah, but this is just your rating. Like, it's not a kind of objective measure of how people actually feel about them. Yeah,
exactly. So whenever it comes down to this stuff, I always want to think about representation, right? So a lot of the conversations that we have in that area, the whole thing of making sure that, making sure that people are represented in the creative that they're seeing, but also industry as a whole. So who is represented at the moment?
Yeah, I think there's all sort of different ways you can approach this. And to a degree, we're making a,
sweeping.
For time purposes, we're going to pick on, pick on, that's not the right phrase. We're going to select certain things that we think are, maybe we overlook sometimes these conversations. So a big one for me is age. We're quite a young industry, or like we're full of young people. Yeah. So, I look at the stats in this earlier, I think according to our research, 1 in 10 marketers are over the age of 45, but in the UK as a whole, that's around half of the UK is over the age of 45.
Wow.
Or is that the adult population?
Excluding kids. Yeah. Wow. But to me, I'm being very ageist at the moment. I'm going to get cancelled for this. But I would have expected it to be a lot younger.
What's in the UK is even younger? Or
no, it's in like the average age of marketers.
Okay.
Do you not think?
I don't know. Maybe I don't go to enough industry events, so I don't get a proper read of things. Yeah. I mean, I suppose we're quite a young company, aren't we?
Yeah, so, true. Yeah. So I'm being skewed. But yeah, I mean, I guess so. If only 1 in 10 in the UK are over the age of 45.
But yeah, I suppose the second part of this, and what other people would usually say, is that, of course, that's where a lot of spending power is people on the age of 45. Yeah. So, I think the implications of this are fairly obvious. Is maybe there's a bit of a, what do you call it, like a fountain of youth effect with marketing. It's like, we're young, I think as humans we always want to be young, so we surround ourselves with the imagery of young people in a way that, again, not representative of those people in the world, but people who might be buying your products and spending the money on your products. Yeah. And something else I mentioned, I think is related to this. All these things overlap.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
Not complete separate factors, but I guess maybe like a London or city bias is perhaps more accurate.
Yeah.
And that, we come to the cities to get these jobs, right? And that's where a lot of us work.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me that the majority are in London. But I do think like other hubs have definitely gained a bit more traction. Like Manchester is huge for like marketing and advertising scene, Birmingham as well. But also Bournemouth for like creative digital agencies. That's like really...
Yeah, that's where Bournemouth Uni is quite big for PR,
massive,
isn't it?
Yeah. And also like all things like digital marketing. So they have a lot of like agencies around where you could quite easily, if you're at Bournemouth Uni, you could go and do work experience and, time there. So, okay, talk to me about the London thing. So do we see that the majority of marketers are in London, or does our data show that these pockets are really kind of popping up?
Yeah, so London is the main thing that jumps out. So I think, the UK population is around, I think 15% is normally the stat that's given. It's 15% in London, 85% outside. Yeah. But I think it's around a third of marketers that live there. So, it's like... A
third of marketers in the UK live in London. Yeah. That's crazy.
And our data goes down to regional level. So, we could see that there's... I mean, I'm just quoting, for example, like maybe there's more in the Northwest. We wouldn't necessarily get that read into Manchester specifically. But I think what he's saying is true. And throughout this episode, we're going to allude to Andrew Tenzer, who's done a lot of research in this area. the approach to this is quite inspired by his work. We'll probably leave a link in the description. And he said, yeah, it's not necessarily like a London bubble thing so much as like, you know, this tendency of marketers to overlook certain factors is kind of present in other cities, as I think you attested to earlier. And I think I always find this quite interesting because I think sometimes we forget that the UK is incredibly diverse geographically.
Yeah.
Like, I think if you know people who's moved to the UK, like one thing to comment on is like how many different accents we have. And that's like a very clear symbol of, you know, Cornwall, Essex, Yorkshire, Somerset. Like these are all massively different places.
Yeah.
I sometimes find it quite interesting that maybe that's not something that we factor into account. And I feel, and this is my personal opinion, that, you know, regional identity is important for a lot of people, like where you live, where you choose to put down roots, like these things really matter. But then of course, maybe if we're in the middle of London or in the middle of Manchester, like there's just certain ways of life maybe that we end up putting into the work that again, someone who's in these other places might not fully recognize.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know we actually have some data on whether people feel represented in advertising or not. And you did a really, really interesting LinkedIn article a while ago now. And honestly, it's like my favorite piece of content that you've done. But it was around like the most underrepresented person in marketing. And you told the story of like a day in her life. And I know I'm going on a tangent here, but it's just so fascinating, firstly, in our data to be able to see like what the average day would look like for someone who is so like underrepresented. But I just wanted to talk more generally about like representation in advertising. So where does our data stand on that? Because we're talking a lot about echo chambers and being in a bubble. So what's the story there?
I think it's quite straightforward, and it's probably not unsurprising. Is like how to put this, demographics are most likely to work in marketing, that we said, you know, young in cities, also most likely to feel represented, which I think is, you know, sort of bolsters the case that like it's natural to put yourself and the world around you into these things, right?
Yeah.
And again, I think sometimes it's so subconscious. It's like it's kind of hard to spell out, but I think you know it when you see it. If you're in a place where like, you know, a bit of ad creative just kind of feels like London in a sense of like it draws busy streets, like people rushing to a train, and it doesn't actually capture, you know, necessarily a way of life as other parts of the country. I think there's an interesting case study at the moment that's happening here with Uber, which I don't know about you, but I always tend to think of as like quite a London brand because when it started, you know, it's obviously like entrenched competition. It's Uber and the cabs here, but Uber's quite an interesting situation now. We've seen our research has grown pretty steadily over the last few years, and it's quite big in most of the UK or parts of the UK now. So they're in a position where they're going to new cities, they're opening up and trying to win over custom from local cab providers. And in November 2024, they started this new campaign where they're using more local imagery for places like Sunderland, Bradford, Durham, that kind of thing. Like there's a video where it's like some women on a night out, like on this cobbled street in Sunderland. I've not been to Sunderland, but the sense I get is, a lot of streets cobbled. And it's tying in the product and this problem, but also local context together really well. Maybe they're not getting it right. Like, you know, if you're from Sunderland, please don't come after me. I don't want the smoke. But like to me as an outsider, it seems like, that probably seems more like it rather than like this imagery that's been built in London is just kind of like, do you know what I mean, distributed across the whole country. So that's a really interesting one I find where that sense of, you know, geographical diversity, places being different for each other is recognized.
100%. You know, just more broadly, it's funny, we're talking about, you know, their marketing people have probably quite similar mindsets. And I often look at ads that have gone really wrong and think, God, who signed that off? You know, and to be honest, it probably was signed off by 6 or 7 people, but those people will have potentially come from very similar backgrounds, had maybe very little diversity of thought and diverse experiences, diverse cultures, and just different points of view. And I honestly think that's why I'm such an advocate for just getting different people from different walks of life in a room to pitch in on a concept or idea. But, you know, I guess that's one of the reasons that we're doing this podcast, right? Is to shine a light on the fact that marketers generally seem to be from pretty similar walks of life and have gone through pretty similar journeys to get here.
I think, I mean, that's why I sort of made that point about, you know, it's all part of the process, the system, isn't it? Like, and this isn't true everywhere, you know, of course, like there's places that, you know, recruit people in many different ways, but like it's no one's fault. It's just like when it becomes this kind of self-selecting system, it's natural that you end up in that position. And then I suppose there's an obligation to look at the data, do some research, like other methods you can use as well to really understand, one, recognize the bubble you're in, and then two, look outside it. Now, there's another thing that came out from the research that we were doing about marketers, how they're different, that I don't think is talked about a lot. And I think maybe it's a bit of pill for us to swallow, but like compared to the average person in the UK, like we're quite rich. Like,
really?
Was it? Yeah, like we earn a lot more. Like I think I was looking at this, so like the magic number seems to be around 60k. So like
average salary for a marketer?
Well, as in like above that, we're more likely to be earning that.
Fine.
Less likely to be earning less. If you see what I mean,
You got it.
Seems to be the sort of point of difference. And yeah, okay, you could make a point of like, oh, maybe it's because we're based in London. You know what I mean? Like we actually have the same spending power, right? Because most of us are here, cost of living is higher. But then actually you look and we're more likely to buy things like champagne or luxury watches that would indicate you have more money to spend.
So marketers are more likely to spend money on luxury items than regular, non-marketers, basically.
And I suppose, the immediate, it's funny you mentioned that because I think, well, the immediate explanation is because you have more money to use, but then maybe there's something like prestige, status signaling matters to us more.
Yeah.
But I find it interesting because I wonder if, is there a sort of unconscious bias that comes in, if that's the right phrase, like it's just easy to assume people have more discretionary spending power than they do.
Yeah.
Because we are going to judge it on our own spending patterns.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing I'd say to that as well is we're talking a lot about, trying to be relatable to the people that you're marketing to. And if you are in this bubble, then you run the risk of being #unrelatable, as the kids would say. But that's an implication for marketers to consider, right? Like if we on a graph, if we over-index for these certain things, like an affinity to luxury items, higher salary, that sort of thing, you really need to be mindful when you're putting together campaigns and figuring out how you're going to market to people that are in a different bracket to you. Yeah,
it's like, I suppose to me, and again, I'm coming as more of a sort of data guy, like, I think like, do we perhaps perceive people to be buying in more materialistic ways because maybe that's what drives our purchase decisions, or like, do we fully understand like the trade-offs that someone might have to make if they don't have as much spending power of like they're getting this thing, like, okay, it requires like, it's like a month's salary or whatever, like that kind of thing. It's something I find interesting to consider. And the other thing that came out, and I think this has been talked about more, to be fair, I think especially with what's happened politically in the last few years, is education. Us being more likely to have a degree. And I think we mentioned that right at the top in terms of, not so much now, I don't think, but certainly when I started in the industry, like the original job I applied for, specified you have to have a degree. Or, equivalent experience, and ideally it should be in these fields.
Yeah.
And even for me, I'd been to university, I was like, oh, I haven't quite done this subject. And you can see how that pattern extrapolate more broadly, like, well, who's not applying then because they don't feel brought
100%,
in?
100%. Really sorry, but going just back to the money point, do we have data on, or can we see, like, are marketers more likely to own credit cards? Do we have any info on that?
I mean, I could check it. I could check it right now if you want to.
And check it right now.
We could cut and then come back. I mean, let's go for it.
Well, I was just thinking that the conversation around, like, we've got here in the notes, like luxury watches, luxury cars, champagne. I'm just so curious to know what extent of that is coming out of your paycheck and what is being bought on credit. You know?
So I've just gone in the platform and looked at this. So I think I'm just making sure I read this right. So 71% in the UK have a credit card, but 83% in marketing do.
Interesting.
So it's more likely.
That is quite a substantial rise, no?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they're pretty high to begin with. It seems most people in the UK have one.
Interesting.
But we are still more likely to.
Yeah, interesting. Sorry, I digress. Going back to the degree conversation. So this is a really interesting one. And I think we mentioned politics as well. Like it's a kind of similar trajectory. But firstly, it can be a massive indicator of like how people vote and the kind of political kind of line you go down. Devil's advocate here, some of the smartest marketers I know actually didn't do a degree, like didn't go to uni, and they actually just either did apprenticeships or did like on the job learning, or but I think there's a bit of a vicious cycle, rock and hard place feeling where, I mean, you were saying earlier, like you either have a degree or you have like 3 years of equivalent experience. But it's the classic, you know, to get a job you need experience, but without the experience you can't get the job, right? So is there anything else you want to talk about there with in terms of the degree and like how that affects like what marketers need to be mindful of, or how that differs to the UK population?
I suppose I was just thinking about this. I think, well, I think you made the point earlier about diversity of thought, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's so easy that, you know, I think we've both been to university, and I think you go through it with a sense of like, well, this is the pinnacle of education, right? Now you sort of like, you develop your critical thinking skills, you come out into the world. And I'd say actually, like, having worked for a few years in the industry now, like, you realize it's useful in some sense, but it comes with blind spots as well about maybe more practical things. I think you talk about people with more vocational experience, right? The kind of hands-on things, or even just knowledge of people in certain situations, you know, like people's circumstance between 18 and 22 might be very, very different. And yeah, it's interesting to consider.
We also had data that we talked about in our recent Connecting the Dots report, which is our flagship report that we create every year to kind of talk about the biggest upcoming trends. And one of the trends that we've uncovered is the fact that younger generations are less interested in going to university. Yeah. And we've seen that especially in the US, but the trend does also have some weight in the UK. So I think it's a really interesting time for companies to maybe reconsider the kind of emphasis they put on a degree, and really, you know, understand that there are different paths to careers, many different paths to careers. And I think a lot of the more vocational routes are there. A lot of them are kind of very much in development. Like there's now been the launch of T-levels, which are a lot more on hands work and you know, really open to kind of, I might be getting this wrong, but like, you know, 16, 17, 18-year-olds who would kind of, or even college students that are just thinking of maybe the degree isn't the right way for me, and, you know, something more hands-on is. Yeah. So there's a lot to be said there for brands and job descriptions.
Yeah. And this is sort of a, you know, just a hypothetical, but I sometimes think, you know, if you're someone who, let's say you spent some of your teen years like working in your family business, something you're dealing with customers every day, you'd have great insights into how, you know, shoppers, consumers behave, you know, compared to me. I did English Literature University. I got a lot from it, but that's not to say that you can't get a more, you know, rich, well-rounded experience otherwise.
Yeah. So moving on to my favorite topic, I want to psychoanalyze ourselves and marketers as a whole. So when we talk about personality types, there's a massive trope of, you know, I'm a sucker for a Myers-Briggs test, or the one that tells you like which color you are. You know, like the book Surrounded by Idiots has the 4, like a red person, a blue person, so on and so forth. I'm a yellow, in case you were interested, and you're a blue, in case you wanted to know that too. But I vividly remember as a marketing team, we all did the 16 personalities test, which is, I think, like a version of Myers-Briggs, but just made more accessible. And the most fascinating thing was I thought we would all, you know, sit there and like learn about each other and, you know, really understand that we were so different and we need to start working together in better ways because, you know, we've such different strengths and weaknesses. Honestly, about 75% of us in the room were a single personality type, which was the protagonist.
So it's the opposite problem, if anything.
Literally. So I was like, fascinating. How are we all so similar? And also, like, how did I not notice that before? Which I think is also really interesting.
I guess
I'm not a psychologist.
If everyone thinks they're the protagonist, right?
Yeah, everyone thinks they're, what is it? Main character syndrome. Yeah. Like, literally. So what are some of the most distinct personality traits that marketers share, and how, if at all, do they differ from the general population in the UK?
Well, I think main character syndrome, main character energy isn't a bad way to put it. So I think we mentioned
foreshadowing.
Yeah. I mean, we mentioned him already, but Andrew Tenzer and his partner Ian Murray, they've done some great research into this. And, you know, I'm massively simplifying here, but like one thing they identify as common trait on marketers is that we're broadly speaking more individualistic than, you know, I hate using this phrase, but like, you know, regular people.
Yeah.
And, you know, in many ways, in certain situations like experimental conditions, you know, they would actually be more selfless than we might, which I think is quite hard for us to swallow sometimes, because we think we're, you know, the empathetic class.
100%.
We understand people, right? That's what we do for a living. But actually, when it comes down to it, that's not always the case.
Yeah. So are we like less charitable? Are we like, what's
well,
the deal?
I mean, this is something we discovered from the research we did, and it's one of my favorite insights of all time, is that as a group, Marx is more likely to donate to charity, but we're less likely to want to help others.
I can't be bothered, but my money will.
Yeah, I mean, we've got the money to put there.
Clearly,
right?
we've got credit cards, we've got luxury champagne, cars, all sorts. That's really funny. So I guess a bit of a contradiction there, right? So quite individualistic. I'm getting the sense that I made a joke at the start, but I said narcissistic as a joke, and now I'm slowly realizing that maybe that's not so far from the truth. What about other attributes, like anything around, you know, okay, we don't want to help people, but tell me more about that individualistic sense.
Yeah. So I think, again, like when you look at these, obviously all these factors, you know, they're kind of difficult to entangle. So I don't want to suggest that like you get a job in marketing and then this stuff just comes at you, but maybe it's because of the age profile.
Yeah.
Maybe what we actually talk about is hallmarks of younger people, because we're a young industry, we just see this more often.
Yeah.
But, you know, things that we notice are we're more likely to be money driven. We love to stand out. And I think we put a greater value on personal success than the average person, the rest of the UK
really
population.
I guess all of these things are just kind of boiling down to the same thing, right? And again, with the whole marketing side of things, like marketing to other people, again, it's, you know, we're in a room full of very similar people and we're trying to get the attention of people that might be quite different to ourselves, right?
Yeah.
And us. And we just need to be a bit mindful about projecting our view of the world onto other people, because it sounds like it's quite a different view, if I'm honest. Like there's not many crossovers, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're obviously pulling apart
we're talking
points
about
of difference.
exactly.
There are things that we have in common, and you know, that's something that we can touch on another time, I think. But you know, I think it's such a human tendency to project, isn't it? Because we're such social animals, right? And we gravitate towards the people like us.
Totally.
And before you know it, you can kind of lose contact with. Well, I mean, it's what the data brings you back with. I think in the best case. Yeah,
fair enough. What about things around like hobbies and interests and stuff like that? Like, do we share any like big traits around? Because I'm just thinking like marketers probably quite tech savvy, right? I mean, I literally use, I'm not about to say I'm so tech savvy myself, but I use ChatGPT like every single day. And I know a lot of my friends, some in finance, some in, you know, different roles. And they're like, I have never even logged on to that. Like I would never use it. So I think that's fascinating. Is there anything that we can see in our data around, you know, attitudes towards, I don't know, emerging tech or new things that are coming up?
Yeah. I do think we have a trait where, and I'm putting my own crude label on this, where I do think we like the shiny new thing.
100%.
You know, sometimes emphasis on the shiny, sometimes emphasis on the new, but just to pull out some data points where again, marketers are very distinct in their behaviors. So yeah, much more likely to use ChatGPT, but also to be excited about AI.
Yeah, fair enough.
Which I think speaks to your point. Maybe you've got to recognize how AI fits with like values of other people. It impacts how they're going to adopt it. And of course, big trend in the industry at the moment around AI products, right?
Yeah.
A lot of brands thinking about that.
Yeah, but also I think a lot of us, especially in the copywriting and content world, there was at one point, maybe still is, a big fear around, is AI going to take over my job? Am I going to be replaced by tech? And when I was at Brighton SEO, this came up a lot. And actually in other conferences that I've been at, it's like, you know, front of mind right now. And even for publishers, everyone who works in the world of copy and content is worried about it. But at the same time, I definitely think in more recent months, there's certainly been a wave where people are like, oh, hang on, this can actually help me do my job quicker. Yeah. And can give me a much better jumping off point. You know, I use it a lot for ideation and for like, you know, proofing things that I you know, the naked eye misses a lot of typos. I'm the first to admit that. But I do think there's maybe now a bit more of a balance, but the excitement thing is really interesting around, you know, marketers are excited about AI and its potential. So yeah, I think the fear versus excitement thing is, it's a tightrope that people are walking, but that's really interesting that we skew more towards excited.
Yeah, I mean, we're more likely to be reading TechCrunch. We're more likely to be following tech trends, buying new tech products. I mean, I'm trying to think of a recent example, but maybe when the Vision Pro came out, Apple's headset, like, we're all talking about it. Like, we might not be buying it, but we're in that sense of like, this is important. This is a thing we've got to focus on, and thinking about it through that lens. And again, there's a lot of literature around this, like how, actually for the majority of people, like, they engage with technology in a slightly different way. And as you say, there's maybe sort of cultural reservations about like how it fits into their lives, into their roles, that maybe we're a bit out of touch from. And the other thing that comes out to me, and again, I'm sort of putting a crude label on this, a very sort of basic summary, but like the brands that come out as being the most distinctive ones we use are quite interesting because they all seem like brands that I read about a lot as like examples, case studies, or like, trends in action, right? Like
brands doing it right.
Yeah. So, or like brands are just in the public eye in our world. So these, we mentioned ChatGPT. You can include that as a brand.
Yeah.
Tesla, Be Real, Prime energy drinks, like even maybe you could argue Guinness, which has become very, very cool in the last year or so.
It has become really cool, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It's like taken off. It's like, oh, now everyone drinks Guinness.
Maybe that's one for a future podcast
a whole podcast episode on Guinness.
But there's one I find really interesting, if only because, so I think my sort of period in market research overlaps quite a lot with Patagonia being in the UK.
Interesting.
Which is like we're 4 times, I think it's like 4 times more likely to buy Patagonia products.
Marketers are
4
times more likely. That's fascinating. So I wonder if marketers have some subconscious appreciation of good brand that gets it right and has that level of authenticity. Patagonia is a great example of that. The other thing I want to add in here, at least in my view, Patagonia is quite a heritage brand. Started, I think, in 1973, but feels new.
Yeah. It's definitely been an industry darling the last few years. I think obviously we're talking about data in the UK, right? I think to us it's still quite new in the way that some American brands can be. I think, when Hollister first came over here, they'd probably been established in.
And Abercrombie and Fitch as well. Like that was like such a big deal to go into the Abercrombie and Fitch store and get a photo with one of the models.
I suppose, it's tangible, like some of the fast food chains that have come over here. It's like, oh my God, like there's
even Chipotle. Yeah. I didn't realize Chipotle was in the UK.
Yeah, like Wendy's, like Taco Bell's, loads of them.
Exactly.
So there is that element. Like, they're new to us. But Patagonia was interesting because I think about this a lot, and because I was thinking like what we say about like, well, we are richer than the average person. Like it sounds like a weird flex saying it.
Horrible to say.
Yeah, put the champagne bottles out of shot. But because there's 2 ways coming at this. I think one is like, is there an aspect of we can just afford these products? And is there an element of, I don't want to pick on Patagonia specifically, but like, is an element of like, okay, well, we can buy it, therefore you can sort of assign a kind of motivation to it in kind of retrospect, but actually it's just a kind of premium brand that we like wearing and showing that we have.
Yeah.
The other thing is I'd mention is that we have a question in our survey about basically like, what do you want brands to do? And the top option for marketers, I'm pretty sure, is be socially responsible. Whereas for average UK person, it's listen to customer feedback.
Interesting.
And that is sort of symbolically quite interesting, I think. It's like, we put a weight on social responsibility because we're in that world where we just talk about it a lot. But again, is it all, I don't want to say it's never like aligning with consumers, but it's definitely worth thinking about how much it is.
Yeah. I do wonder that. I know we've done articles before about how sustainability is actually a bit of a luxury. And you wouldn't necessarily make the green choice if you can't afford to.
Yeah, it's been such an interesting thing seeing our research over the last few years with what's happened with inflation is that, essentially as inflation went up and that people became more concerned about their income or like their spending power was reduced, like we saw a lot of sustainability related data points just drop.
Yeah.
And it does seem to correlate with the spending power you have. I guess it's like comes back to the hierarchy of needs thing, right?
Yeah.
The other thing that I would mention in terms of still related to this topic about trendy brands, like gassy brands, like another common thing that comes out is like there's stuff that I think is popular in general that we don't gravitate to as much. So it's like popular but not cool.
Oh, because like we're so indie.
Maybe.
What are those things?
So these would be things like watching soap operas on TV. Like EastEnders, Coronation Street, like, yeah, they're pretty popular, but they're not something we like to watch.
Yeah.
Heavy metal music, I think, is an example. Like,
I'm surprised that that's even in the popular camp.
well, I mean, it's more popular with,
Fine.
you know, the average person than it is for us.
Yeah.
But that's such a, because we talk so much about communities, right? And like, they need to tap into them, but maybe we make certain exceptions.
Yeah. So basically what we need to do is make our adverts like soap operas and pair them with heavy metal music.
I mean, I think that is the winning formula.
Perfect.
I think indisputable. But not, you know, even like, I was thinking like drinks brands like Carling, Strongbow, like, again, this is just my opinion, but like we wouldn't talk about those in our world because they're not cool. Like they're literally like the most mainstream alcohol brands, but they're clearly doing something right if they're that popular.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sorry, I was going to say on a related point as well is that, you know, we discover a lot of brands through social media and not TV, whereas for the average person, it's the opposite. And again, we might gravitate a bit much more towards brands, you know, that we're seeing a lot on Instagram, right? Because that's the environment we're in, and perhaps overlooking TV and radio, your more traditional channels.
I actually love the radio. So when I'm working from home, I have the radio on all day because I don't want the extra job of being DJ.
Yeah.
I can only do one thing at a time, and that is my job. So I have to put...
Greg James does the rest.
Yeah, well, BBC Radio 2 is actually my go-to. Or the country station.
Okay.
Love country music. Or chill station.
Okay, well, yeah, it's quite a range.
Yeah, I'm just so diverse. So I guess just to wrap things up then, you know, what's the kind of key takeaway then for marketers here? Because we want to be mindful of our blind spots, right? And how we differ. So any pithy takeaways for marketers, putting you on the spot here?
Well, like a lot of things, the first step is probably acceptance.
Yeah.
It's probably...
I don't really want to accept that I'm self-centered.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie to you.
I don't want to say, oh yeah, you know, that we've got a problem or anything. But yeah, I think it's one of the things I've personally found most successful in what I do is like, everyone thinks that they're normal, right? And probably everyone thinks that the, you know, people around them or like other groups of people are the abnormal ones. And genuinely like putting yourself in that position of like, what is perhaps unusual about my beliefs compared to the general population, which data helps a lot with, can be a very useful exercise. It's not again like there's necessarily anything wrong with you, but just understanding, okay, not people go to university or like get this kind of professional jobs. That means that these ideas I have, relatively quite unusual, and I've got to be mindful of that. And I think, I mean, like we were mentioning just now, I think mixing up the media diet is probably an important one because, I think from what I've learned from this, I would spend more time on Facebook, more time listening to the radio. I'd watch more Coronation Street, but me personally, I'd probably draw the line at heavy metal. It's just not quite my thing.
Me too.
No offense to the metalheads, by the way.
Yeah, no offense to the metalheads. I will continue listening to the radio.
Yes,
Job
you're halfway there.
Job done. I'm onto it. Although there is only so much Ed Sheeran and Adele that I can take, and unfortunately with the radio, you can't skip.
Very true. Very true.
But yeah, we'll broaden our horizons. So let's move on to our final segment of the podcast, our local lowdown, which for those of you who don't know, is basically when we look into an existing market or country and basically just look at behaviors that group this population together. So where are we zooming into today?
Yeah, so this is a latest addition to the GDY family. This is Serbia.
Exciting.
So our 54th market we've added quite a few markets around that kind of Central Eastern European region a lot recently. And they're fascinating because every time we add them, we learn something about that market, but then we also learn about the region as a whole because we start to see certain data points crop up in these countries more and more. So Serbia is very interesting. One, they absolutely love tennis, which I think, you know, Novak Djokovic is, I would say, is iconic status there. So that's understandable.
Yeah.
Really interesting stuff around Chinese brands because, you know, I won't go into it here, but you can sort of understand there's a lot of Chinese investment in the area, so Chinese brands have a strong presence there. But the thing I'm most interested in, that seems quite distinctive, is the Serbians are really into beauty and cosmetics. So
interesting.
Of all our markets, they're most likely to buy makeup, to use permanent hair dye, use bronzer, taking the crown from Ireland.
Yeah, so this really made me laugh because I honestly, the fact that Ireland is the most, I could never say the word Ireland. I do it in an accent. That was the most likely place of consumers to buy bronzer. And when I saw that it was Serbia, and I was like, Chris, you've got this wrong. Look, it's not Serbia, it's Ireland.
Yeah, Serbia's taken the crown.
They've taken the crown. But that's what's fascinating when we add new markets to the data.
Yeah.
we can see actually there's a different picture showing, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll run down some of the theories that
tell
exist for
me.
this. Yeah, it's like, as with all these things, like, we've got some idea. It's not something you can come up with a concrete answer for, but they're all very interesting. So I think we talked a few weeks ago about, or like a few episodes ago about Poland and transition from communism to capitalism. It creates all these sorts of interesting
trust
lingering
dynamics,
effects. Yeah. So there is one theory that, you know, Serbia used to be part of Yugoslavia, which is a communist country, and cosmetics isn't really like a huge market there because cultural imagery around women is more about, okay, women as workers and women as mothers. And like, in a sense, it was quite emancipatory, like women sort of, you know, viewed kind of roughly equal status in the workplace, but then maybe like a bit of bronzer is, you know, is a bit bourgeois. Whereas obviously in transitions capitalism, suddenly all these brands can come flooding in. There's this new market and a lot of demand because I think people always want to look nice, look presentable. That's kind of a persistent human trait. Suddenly like, wow, like, oh my God, suddenly this stuff is super relevant. And there's a very interesting music scene from 90s and 90s in Serbia that's kind of persists to present day called turbo folk, where the female singers, like, they use very, very heavy makeup. Like, that's a real part of how they present themselves. And it's just a good visual indicator of what that stuff was. Then there's another theory that I came across from a social scientist, which is that part of the world historically, or since the end of World War II, has always had a bit of a surplus of women just because a lot of men died serving. And there is an argument to say there's more women essentially competing for fewer men. So you kind of
fascinating.
So we might call it like the dating scene now, right? Like you probably wouldn't use that phrase certainly then, but does cosmetics, you know, beauty products become a more important way of competing for the few available good men, right?
Fascinating.
And yeah, it's so interesting to me that, you know, you can have these historical events, but they've still got a lingering impact that we can we get that data first wave in 2024 and you still see suggestions that it's there.
That's really interesting. Anything else, or is that the
for Serbia? I think that's the main things, but the love of tennis is particularly striking.
That's really nice. Great. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us. If you liked what you saw, obviously please like and subscribe and click the bell. If you want to get these insights delivered straight to your inbox, you can sign up to the newsletter that all of this is based on, called On the Dot, and you can do that on gwi.com. Thanks. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you.